I'm John Burnham Schwartz, Literary Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and this is Beyond the Page. In this episode, recorded live at the 2023 Sun Valley Writers Conference, New Yorker staff writer Patrick Radden Keefe, who's garnered prizes ranging from the National Magazine Award to the Orwell Prize to the National Book Critics Circle Award for his meticulously reported, hypnotically engaging work on the many ways people behave badly, tells a few stories and lifts the hood on what he calls his abiding preoccupations: crime and corruption, secrets and lies, the permeable membranes separating licit and illicit worlds, the bonds of family, and the powers of denial.
Thank you all for coming. What a thrill to be here with you in this air-conditioned space. So in between these books and the podcast, my day job is that I write for the New Yorker magazine. And I've written for the magazine since 2006. But it's actually one of those weird cases in which this was something that I knew I wanted to do since I was just a little older than my son Lucian is. When I was in high school, this is just outside Boston, I would go to the periodicals room at our library. It's funny, when I talk to younger people and I mention a periodicals room, they just look at me blankly. For them, the periodicals room is your phone, right? But it used to be that you would have these walls. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all the beautiful magazines arrayed. And I remember probably being about 16 or 17 years old, taking down the New Yorker at one point and reading a long New Yorker story. I don't even remember what the first story was, but it felt like this huge discovery to me because I had read short stories in my English class, fictional short stories. And of course, I was reading nonfiction books and newspaper articles, but this seemed like a kind of beautiful combination of the two. And I really came to conclude that it was kind of the perfect form. It was substantial enough that, you could really immerse yourself in a story, and it felt like there were characters and there was a beginning, middle, and end, and you could learn a great deal, but also short enough that you could finish it in a sitting, that it wasn't this thing that you had to keep coming back to. I'm sure there are some of you in the audience who subscribe to the New Yorker and it just piles up on your bedside table like an accusation, and you're thinking, well, maybe it's not quite that easy, but I felt that there was just something kind of wondrous about that form. And even at the time, I remember telling one of my teachers in high school, when I grow up, I'm going to write for the New Yorker magazine. And she kind of chuckled dryly and said, well, good for you. You do that. And it took a long time. I had a whole series of detours. I went to grad school. I went to law school, believe it or not. And the whole time I was pitching the New Yorker, on the wall of my home office back in New York, I have a framed rejection letter from 8 years before my first article was accepted. So it was a lot of rejection. Thank you. Here's to learning how to metabolize rejection. I had plenty of opportunities to do that, but I've been writing for the magazine since 2006, and I love it. And part of what I love about it is that I don't have a beat. I'm not really a specialist in anything. I can kind of move from subject to subject. I only write sometimes 3 to 4 stories a year, sometimes just one story a year. My wife is also here, and if she were up on stage with me, she would look out at you and say, and he calls it a full-time job. But these stories take a great deal of reporting, and there's a kind of architecture to them. It's, I've got my process. And it's funny because my editor at the New Yorker, I've been working with the same editor since 2006, and he says I do have a beat, and he calls it the investigative melodrama. The idea being that it's investigative journalism often, but what I'm most interested in is telling a story as you would in fiction, identifying interesting characters, thinking about when you withhold information, when do you deal out each card to the reader so that it's actually kind of a pleasurable experience and you keep turning the pages. And this isn't really an abstract question for me. I'm sometimes asked, who's the reader you have in your mind when you sit down to write? And for me, there's nothing hypothetical about that because I see these readers anytime I get on the New York subway. I'll see people pull the New Yorker out of their bag. And a lot of the time, it's like they get on at 14th Street, they're going to get off at 42nd, it's just a few stops, they're halfway through an article, and you see them. You're kind of attentive to the fact that you want them to keep turning those pages. You want them to keep reading. What is it that pulls somebody into a story? And what is it that kind of pushes them out? There have been a couple of occasions over the years when I've had this experience on a week when I have an article in the magazine. And it's a little weird, right, to be on the subway car and see somebody pull out the New Yorker, and then they turn the page and they start reading your article. And on the few occasions when this has happened, my internal monologue is, should I say something? I'm sure many of you have been to New York City and perhaps had the occasion to ride on the subway. Not a place where you want to make, unexpected overtures to a stranger. So nevertheless, there have been these moments where I'll kind of move forward. And there was one time in particular where I saw somebody, they took out the magazine, they turned the page, there's my article, they start reading, they're reading the first paragraph. I start inching over to them. And they're happily reading along, and I'm getting closer and closer. And I'm reaching out to tap them on the shoulder and say something when they get to the end of the first paragraph, and they turn to the next article. I didn't say anything, needless to say, but that kind of experience, right, it sort of brings home for me that I'm not an academic. Nobody's required to read what I'm writing. I have to fight for your attention on every paragraph, on every page. So I thought what I would do today is just talk to you a little bit about a handful of these stories that are collected in this book, Rogues. So Rogues came out last year. It's just out in paperback now. It's 12 stories from the last 12 years in the magazine. And it's funny, when we sat down to put it together, the idea was sort of a greatest hits collection. Let's just find the ones that really mean a lot to you. I mentioned earlier, I don't have a beat. I write about whatever I want. It was a little humbling to do this process of pulling together these articles, because I realized that there are these themes that I do keep coming back to. Like, it feels like free choice to me, but in fact, I have these preoccupations that I keep coming back to. And often it's about people behaving badly in one way or another. There was a really extraordinary panel, which many of you may have seen this morning, the first panel on fiction writing. And I thought that the point about how we're all kind of living in these constructed realities, that we all tell ourselves a story about who we are and the life we lead. I mean, it was beautifully articulated, better articulated than I've ever been able to. But that, to me, is in some ways the theme I'm most interested in. Years ago, I used to write screenplays occasionally, none of which you would have seen because none of them got made. But there's an old adage in Hollywood that if it's a good villain in the movie, the villain doesn't think that he's the villain in the movie. He actually thinks he's the hero of the movie. Like, he's watching a whole other movie than you are. And that's an aspect of this process that's always really interesting to me. So I'm just going to tell you a handful of stories about different pieces that are in here and how they came together and what I think of as the magic of doing this kind of work, writing these kinds of stories, and also reading them. The first one is about Chapo Guzman. So I have a little bit of a subspecialty at The New Yorker, which we call the write-around. So it's often the case in journalism that if you want to profile somebody, you want to write about somebody, the first step is you go to them and you say, hey, can we interview you? And it's often the case that these people just say no. And a lot of the time, editors will just kind of throw up their hands and say, okay, well, we won't write about them. At The New Yorker, this has happened for years. I mean, for the last 15 years, we have these ideas meetings on Tuesday afternoons. And the price of admission to the meeting is you have to propose 3 ideas for stories that might be in the magazine. And David Remnick, my boss, kind of sits there and it's sort of, thumbs up, thumbs down. And periodically somebody will say, we should do a big profile of Beyonce. And the older hands around the table kind of roll their eyes because it's not as if we haven't asked, right? She won't cooperate with an interview. She doesn't need us. She can do it all on Instagram. And as a consequence, we don't write about her. There are exceptions, and these are what we call the write-around, which is when you don't have access to the central person, and so you write around them. You talk to all the people who know them, you find other interviews they've done, maybe letters, maybe emails, archives, depositions, anything you can to bring that person alive. And I love doing write-arounds. I think it's a real challenge because how do you make a character vivid on the page if you've never had the opportunity to sit down with them? I was talking yesterday about my book on the Sackler family, which is about 3 generations of this family, none of whom agreed to speak to me, a number of whom were actively threatening to sue me the whole time I was writing the book. Nevertheless, I want you, when you're reading the book, to feel like you're in the room with them. Like, not that you're looking at them through a telescope from far away, but that you actually can get a sense of how they are in the room. And you do this by finding people around the people. There's a profile in Rogues of Mark Burnett, the reality TV producer, who made Survivor and made The Apprentice with Donald Trump. And I really wanted to understand Burnett and his relationship with Trump, and he really didn't want me to do that. So he wouldn't talk to me at all for the article. But he had these 2 ex-wives who did. And I have to say that in retrospect, like given the choice between an interview with Burnett, where his lawyer and his PR person is going to be there and they're saying, oh, this is on the record and this is off the record and you can't ask about this, this, and this, and talking to these 2 women who shared their lives with him, I'd rather get the latter. I think it would actually give you a more accurate sense of who the guy is. So, 2014, I wrote this big article about Chapo Guzman. I had actually written about El Chapo before, in 2012, for the New York Times Magazine, before I was full-time at the New Yorker. And you may recall he was the head of the Sinaloa drug cartel, the biggest drug trafficking organization in Mexico. And at a certain point, he got caught. If you're keeping track, this is the first time he got caught before he escaped again, before he was caught again. And as soon as he got caught, I got a call from David Remnick saying, listen, you've already written about this guy. Why don't you write about his capture? And so I wrote this story, which is in the book, called The Hunt for El Chapo. And Chapo didn't talk to me for the story. He was locked up and he was in a prison in Mexico. I didn't think I was going to be able to get access to him, but I wrote this big piece about his criminal career and all of the efforts on both sides of the border to bring him to justice. And it never occurred to me that he might read the article. For a variety of reasons. I mean, part of what's interesting about him, right, is he's running this like multi-billion-dollar drug cartel, but he was actually functionally nearly illiterate. He could text a little bit, but he never really learned to read all that well. And even if he could read, he didn't strike me as like a New Yorker subscriber per se. So I do this big piece. It comes out. Significantly, I think it was written about a lot in the Mexican press because there was a lot of new material in the article, and so then it got picked up in the press in Mexico. And I get into the office one day, this is at the old New Yorker offices in Times Square, and there's a voicemail from a guy who introduces himself as a lawyer for the Guzman family, and he'd like to talk with me. And, I was a little nervous about this. There are things that happen in my workday that I immediately come home and tell my wife about. This was not one of them. That didn't seem like a good conversation to be having. But I wanted to kind of do a little due diligence, and so I called a guy, a federal agent who'd spent years going after the cartel, and I gave him the name of the lawyer. I said, can you just run this name? Is this guy really for real? Is he like a real cartel attorney? And my guy came back to me and he said, yeah, he's a real cartel attorney, but he's one of these cartel attorneys who's like 60% cartel and 40% attorney. So this made me even more nervous. And I didn't know where this was all going to go. I gamed it out a bunch of ways, as you would like on Debate Team or something. If they say this, I say, what are they objecting to? There's a whole passage in the book about how when Chapo Guzman was on the run, one of the big logistical hassles was getting him all the Viagra that he consumed. I was worried that might possibly come up as a feature of their concern. So finally I call the guy, and when he ascertains that I am who I am, he says, El Señor, they call him El Señor. El Señor is ready to write his memoirs. So I really thought about all the ways this conversation could go, and I was ready for anything, I thought, but this was in no way on my bingo card. I had no quick response for this. And so I just kind of stuttered, and I said, well, that's a book I'd like to read. And he said, but sir, is it a book you would like to write? And that is the way Chapo Guzman asked me to ghostwrite his memoir. I said no. Spoiler alert, before I'd gotten off the phone, I said no. It didn't seem like a good idea. I tried to explain that even in the best of scenarios, sometimes the relationship between the ghostwriter and the subject breaks down. It can fray, What was very funny, he was very gracious and nice about it as I got off the phone as quickly as I could, but I was very adamant that I wasn't going to do it. And then a week later, he called and he said, as you continue to consider our offer. And I was like, no, I'm good. I've considered. But I tell this to you as an illustration of how weird it is, this business, right? That I spend 4 months thinking about this guy and trying to kind of conjure him and bring him to life and talking to all these people who know him or have hunted him. And then I write the article and I have no inkling that he's even going to read it, and then the people in his camp read it, and then I think they're going to be angry with me, but they're not angry. In fact, they want me to write his book, which I couldn't. It's just so strange and surreal, this kind of encounter. I'm going to tell you 2 more quick stories. you may get the impression that these are all very dark stories. In fact, I think some of them are quite fun and funny. And I did have a period of time where I've been writing about some very dark stuff. And my boss said, you need a little R&R. What do you want to do for fun? And I said, I want to travel with Anthony Bourdain. So I reached out to Bourdain, and he said that I could write about him. And I took a year writing this profile. It's the last story in the book. And I traveled to Vietnam with him. We had many, many amazing dinners and conversations. I think you could probably argue in retrospect, like, it didn't require a whole year of hanging out with him to write the article, but, a very enjoyable one for me. And we actually stayed quite friendly after the piece came out. My wife was here. We closed down a bar with him in Union Square one night. I was as shocked as anyone, I think, when he took his own life. But if you read the piece, you'll see that there were some dark strains. There was a period of time sort of halfway through that year where I called my editor and I said, this guy's actually in a pretty dark place. But what I want to tell you about just quickly is a wonderful moment of a sort that you just relish as a journalist. One of the weird things about doing this kind of work is sometimes you encounter somebody who's really brilliant at what they do and really terrible at talking about it, which is hard. This often happens with athletes. For instance, I'm from Boston, so I'll use Tom Brady as an example. But you watch Tom Brady on the football field, and he's like Mozart on the football field. And then he comes off the field, and somebody puts a mic in his face, and they say, Tom, tell us about the game. And he says, it was really great. We tried to leave it all out there on the field. And he has no ability to capture in words the magic of what you just saw. And the flip side of that is that there are some people who are amazingly articulate at describing their own experience. I think it's often people who've had a lot of therapy, actually, of kind of seeing themselves in the story. And they can be very accommodating in that way. So the one story about Bourdain that I always think about is we were in Hanoi. He had just had dinner with Barack Obama, who happened to be there. I mean, it's very Bourdain that when Obama went to Vietnam, it was like an incoming call from the White House. It wasn't that Bourdain said, hey, can I have dinner with Obama? It was that Obama said, hey, can I have dinner with Bourdain? And it was a couple of days later, he had just shot a segment at a little roadside cafe. And I was just kind of hanging out because it takes a long time to shoot these segments. And then he came over to me when he finished and he said, hey, do you want to go for a ride? And the production had rented a Vespa for him. And so we got onto this Vespa. There was one helmet. He gave it to me. I hung on for dear life, and we went zooming off. And if any of you have been to Hanoi, there are about 6 million motorcycles and bikes and scooters there. It's incredible in these big, broad avenues. And you kind of go, it's like floodwaters. You sort of go out and you just get borne along by the currents. It was the most magical thing. I was hanging on to him. Part of me was thinking I might die because he was driving fairly recklessly. But there was another part of me that was thinking, I am such a good journalist. I mean, what a scene is this? Should this be the first scene in the article or the last scene in the article? Maybe I do a callback. I do it more than once. And we're zooming along, and I'm kind of patting myself on the back. And it was only later that night when I'm back at the hotel that it occurred to me that he gave me that scene. Bourdain was a writer himself. He was a writer before he was ever on television. He knew the way you construct a story. He knew that you don't just want interviews back and forth sitting across a table. You want scenes. And he was also a really generous guy. And so without making a big show of it, without telling me what he was doing, he kind of handed me this scene, this amazing scene, this incredible experience for me at the time, but also something that I knew I could spin into gold when I had to sit down and write it. And it's the thing I'll always think about with him is that moment where, I was so convinced that I had snookered him and he'd snookered me. Okay, here's the new material. It was a slow year. This is one of these years where I only wrote one article. And I actually started late last year. And I finished on Friday, and it comes out tomorrow morning. So I've never really done this before, but I'm going to give you just a little bit of a sneak preview of this piece that'll be out tomorrow. It's the biggest piece I've ever written. It's a big profile, an 18,000-word profile of Larry Gagosian, the art dealer, who's been sort of the dominant art dealer in the United States for the last 50 years and now has 19 galleries around the world with his name on them. $1 billion in annual revenue. And he's 78 years old, has a 28-year-old girlfriend. and has no heirs. And so there's all these questions about what's going to become of this huge art gallery that he's built when he retires, when he moves off the stage, which he insists he's never going to do. And this was an interesting story because I thought this was going to be a write-around. Gagosian doesn't really give a lot of interviews, and as it happens, some of his clients, people like Steve Cohen, now the owner of the Mets, the hedge fund guy who got in a bit of trouble for insider trading, which I read about in another story in Rogues, and Roman Abramovich, the Russian oligarch who's been sanctioned by the UK and the EU. Some of Gagosian's major clients are people I've written about, let's just say. So I really didn't think that they would give me access, and I started out thinking this was going to be a big write-around, and then they did. And I should say, I earnestly think that it almost always makes sense to talk if somebody approaches you about a piece, in the sense that if you give access, then you're kind of your own best advocate, right? And Gagosian and I ended up having a whole series of long conversations, and he's quoted, kind of characterizing the story as he would, and introduced me to a whole series of friends of his and clients and artists that he works with who told their stories about him. So it's been a fascinating long stretch of time since I began this story. In the fact-checking process, things got a little tense. I saw him in London. We met at Claridge's on the 4th of July, and I had a few slightly tougher questions, which he wasn't thrilled about. I think you don't get to where he is without really liking to exert a lot of control about everything around you. And so I think the piece is a really interesting portrait, but there are some things he didn't want in it, to a point where a few days ago, we started hearing from his lawyer. And I'm going to tell you two things. What I will tell you is that the thing he didn't want in the piece is in the piece. What I won't tell you is what it is, because you need to pick up the New Yorker tomorrow and turn those pages and read the piece. I'd be eager to hear your questions. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Page. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. A good one, we hope. To catch all the latest from the Sun Valley Writers Conference, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to listen to this conversation in its entirety, or to any of our other talks, you can find them at svwc.com. I'm John Burnham Schwartz. Until next time.